The yellow wiggle, the famous yellow wiggle.
Yeah.
And Greg, I can't believe I'm standing here next to Elvis Presley's coat.
The quiz shows
Yeah,
people
this
who
is something that
pretend to take
Elvis
their
probably
music
wore in
seriously.
1969, 1970, and it kind of sums up Elvis's flair for fashion.
Yeah, well, let's take a look at the rest of your collection.
All right.
Sing a song into the rock and roll microphone. Oh yeah!
We interrupt the Wiggles to bring you some breaking news.
Yellow Wiggle has been seen on telly with a dirty skivvy.
We crossed live to his house.
I'm not prepared to talk about it, I'm sorry. But no comment, I'm sorry. But there is one thing I am prepared to talk about. My Elvis Presley collection. You want to have a look?
I'm all shook up. Yeah.
1, 2, hey, hey, testing, 1, 2, 3, hoo. I first went to Graceland about 5 years ago, and after walking through Elvis's home and finding out a bit more about the man, not just the music and the movies, but the person that was Elvis, it really had an impact on me, and I wanted to start collecting items that belonged to Elvis, you know, his clothing, jewellery, books, things like that. This here is one of Elvis's karate gis. There's 6 of these in the world, apparently. One of them is at Graceland on display there, and there's 5 others, including this one. Elvis wore this shirt for a photo shoot for one of his movies. Elvis did 33 movies, and one of them was called Kissing Cousins. And this is that same shirt that he wore in that photograph.
When I could feel
This is the last Cadillac that Elvis owned. He bought it in 1976, and he was pictured driving it the day before he passed away. I initially had the car, then I bought the owner's manual and the remote control for the gates at Graceland. So, I mean, that's pretty cool to have that. Not that it would still work today, I'm sure. When you match up all the things, when all the things line up, you go, yeah, this is the real deal. This television came from Elvis Presley's bedroom at Graceland. It's a pretty cool piece of furniture. I mean, Elvis spent a lot of time in his bedroom. He'd stay in there for 2 weeks at a time. You know, he basically lived there towards the end of the 70s. So you can imagine that something like this was pretty important to him. Well, I've got about 200 items in the collection now. About 100 of those were actually owned by Elvis. So in terms of items that were actually owned by Elvis, it's probably the biggest collection in Australia. The only connection between Elvis and the Wiggles, I guess as we were going through Graceland, there were newspaper stories up on the wall there saying, to wiggle or not to wiggle, that is the question.
Keep on shaking now, shake it all out. Shake.
And you know, Greg, out of that piece, you don't strike me as someone who's really obsessed with Elvis.
Yeah, I guess it's one of those things. I had never seen one Elvis movie until a couple of years ago when I bought a shirt that he wore in the movie Roustabout. And I then wanted to see how often he wore it in the movie. So that was the first Elvis movie that I'd ever seen. I wasn't a huge fan. I wasn't somebody who was obsessed by Elvis so much as somebody who was an admirer of what he achieved.
I'm really interested in the provenance. How do you double-check whether or not what you're getting is the real McCoy?
I'm very fortunate in that I know several people that were friends with Elvis. So quite often they'll remember certain things. You know, they might remember the necklace that Elvis wore, or, you know, the torch that's on the table there. If there's photographs of Elvis with something, and if it looks enough the same, and if there is a letter stating how somebody came into being able to have that item, that's the big thing. How did the person get the item?
Yeah.
And is there pictures of Elvis with it?
Elvis, like all kings, was given lots of gifts himself. And that's interesting. He turned him into a collector himself.
But he loved guns, he loved collecting police badges. And so police officers would turn up at his concerts with badges to give to Elvis, the king. He wanted to become an agent at large for the US government. So this was his plan, to turn up at the gates of the White House with a letter and a gift for President Nixon, which was a World War II Colt gun, you know, a pistol. And I'm sure you couldn't do that today.
No,
They'd probably arrest you for doing something like that. So sure enough, President Nixon meets with Elvis and gives him a badge which I believe was for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Investigation, something along those lines.
I love the irony.
There's a surprise.
Yeah. It is quite amazing.
But that's power. That's power. Turning up to the president unannounced. That's
This
real
was
power.
this necklace he wore?
There's so many photographs of Elvis wearing that particular necklace that you'd have to assume it was one of his favourites in 1970, 1971. Any photograph you see of Elvis when he met President Nixon, he's wearing that lion's head necklace, and it's a beautiful necklace. I mean, beautiful.
Not flashy at all.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's perfectly Elvis.
I'm actually one of these people that believes Elvis is not dead and still alive, and I'm just wondering how you're going to react when he wants his Cadillac back.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's interesting because people will say to me, "Oh, I love your Cadillac," and I say, "Well, it's not mine; it's Elvis's." And I really do feel that. And with all of these things, I mean, I own them, yeah, but
You're a custodian.
yeah, custodian. They're not mine. I mean, they are, but I didn't buy them for me. You know, I bought them because they belong to Elvis.
Yeah.
So they're still Elvis's in some ways because they help tell the story of his life.
Thanks so much for coming in and sharing this with us and sharing it with the nation.
My pleasure.